Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do you think that changes things?
Well, so one, I think what it does is it shifts the framework of the conversation to, I think, something that's actually more helpful for us to talk about, because now we are talking about the morality of abortion in the larger context of the sphere of the life of the individual, and
its mom.
Yeah, and
dad.
what that does is it allows us to kind of see a bigger picture, and I think a bigger picture is always a better starting point.
So this is where we shift from just being pro-life, meaning I don't want abortions,
right,
to saying no, I not only not want abortions, but I also care about the people, the communities, the parents, and this person until he's going to be 18, where he can fend for himself.
Right, and so this is what I appreciate about this argument is it moves us, like you're saying, out of the pro-birth discussion into like the longevity, the socioeconomical, cultural, understanding of the position that the people find themselves.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it kind of makes me think about, because I'm going to be honest, I don't always understand what people mean when they say reproductive justice.
Sure.
Having said that, it reminds me of, do you remember the court hearings when Judge Brett Kavanaugh was nominated? And it was like a whole ordeal, right? I remember, I don't know why, but specifically I remember the snippet of the hearings where he was being questioned, and the questioning was something like this. It was, to your knowledge, are there any laws on the male that hinder or that control the male reproductive? And he goes, well, not to my knowledge. And it's a really poignant question, right?
For sure.
Because the implications of that question are, then why in the world do we have laws or an ethic or a system of morality that would want to regulate that?
Yeah.
Right? So this is interesting to me, because on the one hand, you could see the disproportionate consequences that women have to bear both when they do abort and when they don't.
Right.
And I think Christians should at least have compassion and sympathy to the situations that lead to that.
Sure.
Moving away from anti-abortion to actually being pro, caring about everybody there.
Correct.
That's the first thing that comes to my mind. The second thing, though, is what if there were laws about that?
Sure.
And just humor me for a second, right? I think a common argument is, yeah, but in the case of a rape or an incest, the male doesn't have to bear that their whole life. To ask a woman to not only, physically, no pun intended, bear the result of that trauma for 9 months, but then for the rest of her life, that's a real concern, a real question, right? It's like, well, what if there were laws on that? And here's what I mean by that. I mean, I've heard it kind of in passing and kind of a little snarky. What if we started castrating rapists?
Sure.
What if there were ways to force men, like, no, you can't leave. If you made this child, you need to be responsible. And I'm not just talking about like child support, right? But tangible ways that would more proportionally place the burden of responsibility to actually care for this human. And you know what? I'm for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation, right? Because in the rare instances of like, so like rape and incest make up like 0.01% of abortion cases.
Mostly it's maybe like accidental pregnancies or unwanted.
And so there is something fundamentally different about the way that a woman will experience childbirth from or just any type of this process, because they carry that what they do is so much more important, right, than what the male contributes to the discussion. And so when we talk about like the inclusion of the male, if we talking about something like rape, then we actually force this like repetitive cycle of bad experiences on the victim who has to go through that, right? And so we run into some of these difficulties, right? And so some type of law is probably a good idea in terms of the conversation piece for this. And I think what I appreciate about what she's trying to do in this is like say that this is something that affects somebody for a long time in their life. And as Christians, we need to be people leading the charge in this discussion in terms of having, other methodologies available for people who, if we say, hey, look, if you want to carry it to term, adoption's an available option, or we can walk with you through this, and not condemning people if they do choose to have the abortion, and walking with them through that, right, and through that experience. And so, but I don't know, in her desire to reclaim a sense of justice for the reproductive rights of the female, that is probably something that, or not probably, is something that we need to look at and analyze as a nation on a level. I'm not sure that swinging the pendulum this far is the answer, right? Yes. But it makes sense, because if you've had, if you've not had the access that you deserve and you are entitled to, then of course you're going to try and reach as far as you can and get that. But I struggle with this conversation because I don't know how to parse out, right, the experience of the life developing and the individual who has to carry the life, right? And so there are, like, I do we say as a church, like, hey, there's just some things that are unfortunate or unfair, and this is just one of those things, like the way that biology has played itself out, and just women have to deal with this differently than men? Or as a church, do we come alongside and say, like, yeah, this is something that you have to walk through, and it's the way that biology set up, or it's the way God intended it to be, depending on, what your view on all that is. And it's like, how do we move in that direction where we stand lock and step with people, but still protecting and valuing the sanctity of life, right? Still respecting the rights of the individual, but both individuals that exist in this scenario, instead of simply pretending that the developing zygote isn't an individual or doesn't have some self-agency or actualization that can be progressed,
Good. Yes. So to recap that a little bit, in my mind, the strengths of this position are that it actually targets the weaknesses of the traditional, conservative anti-abortion approach, right? It actually seems to be a valid check against that. However, it doesn't seem that terminating the life itself actually solves the problem.
Right. It just seems to kind of kick the football down the field a little bit.
Correct.
And the idea, right, the notion that the rippling effects of a pregnancy carried to term are going to be more substantive than the ripple effects of having an abortion.
Exactly.
That seems
a little too optimistic.
Yeah, and it's not the experience that I've seen or worked with people or went through myself when I had to have an abortion when I was in high school there because of an ectopic pregnancy experience. And so that's something that I still think about all the time, and that reality is a heavy one to deal with. And so I don't think that it solves the problem like people like to think it does. Yeah, right. And so I think that's something that is a major hole in the thought process and is lacking.
Okay.